Yeah, thanks for having me out here. I'm appreciative to get out of the snow today. It's been kind of a wintry day here in Alberta. Um, just as a little bit of a background, I guess I should share my screen now too here. A little bit about us, I guess. We run a custom grazing ranch by Busby, Alberta, and we're a little bit understocked, some might say, because we actually own 3 goats, 2 donkeys, and 1 llama, and we run about 3,500 acres of pasture land. So that being said, we custom graze, so we bring in other people's cattle. So we don't actually own the animals. We just have a few for basically pets. Now, we have grazed a lot of different types of animals, so I'm going to kind of share that with you a little bit. We've done, obviously, we've grazed cattle. We do graze pigs every year. We've got sheep that we graze. We have in the past. We've had goats. We've done chickens. So we've done a little bit of everything. But our main operation is of course cattle, and on a custom basis. So we actually don't even own the land that we graze on. We lease all of our land. So 3,500 acres that we lease off private landowners. So we're kind of like a community pasture, but it's all private land. So can everybody see my screen? Are we sharing properly?
Yep. Everything's looking good.
Awesome. Okay, well then we will kick into this. So what we teach is management. That's it, right? If you've come here tonight and you're looking for a magic bullet, you're not going to find it. What I sell doesn't come in a box, a bag, or a bottle. Okay, we always try and look for the long-term solution to a problem. So our industry seems to be addicted to Band-Aid fixes, right? We get an injury, so we put a Band-Aid on it instead of actually fixing it. So what we try and look at is the long-term solution to the problem. And with regenerative agriculture, it's a completely different mindset than modern agriculture, what most people are doing. So there's a possibility that you might think I'm a crazy person here tonight, or a little outside the box, but that's okay, because it is a complete mindset change when you get into regenerative agriculture. You could call it sustainable agriculture, whatever you want to call it, but that's just the term I use. We're going to talk about some drought planning tonight. Now, that's only kind of part of my talk, because you can't just focus on one thing. We work in systems, so we have to put the whole system together to make it work. But in doing that, we plan for droughts. One of the biggest mentors I ever had, his name was Dennis Wabasser. He was a holistic management grazer back in Saskatchewan when I was living there. And we went through the 202 drought. I was actually living up here at the time, but he was still my mentor, and I went back there. My family farm is down there. So, and went through the 202 drought. They had 14 months down there in that year with 0 precipitation, no snow, no rain, 14 months straight. So that's a pretty severe drought. And everything was brown, right? The best grazer I know, and everything was brown, right? You look at his land and it's like, well, what did he do wrong? Regenerative grazing is drought resilient. It's not drought proof. But I still remember, I asked him, like, everything was brown, and I looked at him and I said, okay, well, now what do we do? And he didn't even hesitate. First thing he said was, now we plan for the next drought. And that hit me really hard. So ever since 2002, I've been planning for this drought. Okay, I've been planning for the droughts 10, 15, 20 years in advance. Every year I'm planning for a drought. So we're going to go through that. We're going to talk about the water cycle, but we're also going to talk about all the principles and the concepts of grazing as well. But we're going to kind of focus that on water management today. So if we're planning for a drought, we need to start with the soil. The soil is the most important part we have to manage. So I want to talk about a friend of mine, Jean-Baptiste van Helmont. He was a pretty good friend of mine. I didn't know him that well because he was actually born in 1634. But he asked a question. He said, how do plants grow? Okay, he was a scientist back then, and he wanted to know how plants grow. So he did an experiment, and he was actually arrested and thrown in jail because of his results. The reason is because his results went against the modern thinking at the time. So if you can imagine what the modern thinking of the time in 1634 was about how plants grow, So real quickly, I'll explain this experiment to you. So he took, in his words, a large earthen pot, so a great big flower pot, and he buried it in the ground, right? So that was his so things couldn't get out. And he took a bunch of soil and he dehydrated it. So he dried it all out, made it perfectly dry, and he weighed it so that there was 200 pounds of soil, and he put it in this earthen pot. Then he planted a willow sapling in it, one little tiny willow tree, planted it in that pot. And then he covered it with a mesh so that, you know, water could go in, but, you know, soil couldn't blow away. So then he let it grow. He watered it and he let this tree grow. And every time it needed watering, he would water it. But there was nothing added to the soil at all. So he let this experiment go on for 5 years. And after 5 years, this willow tree had grown. He took that out, took the willow tree out, and the roots and the branches and the trunk and everything, took it out and he weighed it. And it was something like 178 pounds of wood was grown. Now, he didn't account for all the leaves that fell off every year. So that's something that he missed, but he still had 178 pounds of wood. So it would have been plus with all the leaves. And then he took out the soil out of this earthen pot and he dried it out again. He dehydrated it and then he weighed it. And it was almost exactly 200 pounds. Okay, so virtually nothing left the pot. So from his experiment, he said that plants grow from water, right? That's the only thing he added was water. And he got 178 pounds of wood. So that was his conclusion. And the people at the time, the modern thinking at the time, didn't like that. They threw him in jail because they believed that the plants grow from the soil, right? That it would use up or eat the soil to grow that tree. So he wasn't very popular and got thrown in jail. But he was missing something. But the problem, he was more right than they were. Okay, what he was missing was photosynthesis. He didn't realize that the carbon that makes those plants comes from the air. Okay, he didn't realize that that water was combining from the air, right? Rain comes from the air, H2O, with the carbon through the process of photosynthesis and forming those plants. And it's funny because every plant, if you look at it, every tree, every weed, every shrub on a dry matter basis has approximately 45% carbon, 45% oxygen, 6% hydrogen, and 1.5% nitrogen. Okay, nitrogen also, by the way, we also get it from the air. The air we breathe is 78% nitrogen. Okay, every breath you take, it's 78% nitrogen. So that's 97.5% of every plant comes from the air. We don't need soil. Right? To grow a plant, we don't need soil. So the mindset shift that we have to do is that we don't grow plants from the soil. Okay, that's not what we should be doing. That's what modern agriculture does, but that's not what we should be doing. So if you see this picture here, the soil grows from the plants. Okay, that's how I look at it. I'm trying to grow soil. I'm not trying to grow plants. It's a completely different way of looking at it. So if you look at this picture, you can see the little kind of triangles coming down. That's where a root was. And the process of sequestering carbon, which very few farmers actually understand how that works. Photosynthesis pulls carbon from the air. Then the plants, you know, build themselves out of the glucose molecules that are produced. And then the roots actually do a process called exudation. So they push sugars out through the root tips and they're feeding the biology, right? They're pumping that out and exchanging nutrients with the biology for the sugar. I call it my underground black market. It's like the mob down there, you know, everybody's trading. And if you went, it's a bug eat bug world out there. If you don't have something to trade, you're going to get, you know, eaten up. So the mob is actually controlled by the plants, right? They're the mob itself because they have the currency. They produce all the sugar. They got all the money. So if a bug or a fungus or a bacteria wants some sugar, they have to trade with the plant. So those plants keep pushing sugar out into the soil, which is feeding the biology and building the soil. So we're adding carbon to the soil through the exudation, right? So there's three processes. We need photosynthesis, we need exudation, and we need soil biology, right? All three of those things. And that's how we're going to build and bind up that carbon in the soil. Okay, so when I'm talking about climate change or environmental issues about pulling carbon, depends who I'm talking to. If I'm talking to urban folks that are concerned about climate change, yeah, I can pull carbon out of the air. That's the good thing that I'm doing. If I'm talking to a farmer, though, it's not that I want to pull carbon out of the air. It's that I want to add carbon to my soil. That's the reason I'm doing it. Because what happens when you get more carbon in the soil? You get more water hold capacity. Okay, you get more biology, you get more nitrogen, because you get a C to N ratio. So depending who I'm talking to, but as a farmer's perspective, my goal is to add carbon to my soil, to grow the soil. That's it. I just use the plants to do that. 85 to 90% of plant nutrition is microbiotically mediated. Okay, we don't have a fertility issue in agriculture. We have a biological issue. We need to get the biology back. And most of modern agriculture, all of our inputs are very detrimental to the biology. So we got to keep adding more fertility, add more chemicals, add more whatever it is, and we end up getting less and less nutrients out of it. If you could reverse that and build the biology, you can get all the fertilizer for free. I haven't used fertilizer on my ranch in over 20, 25 years. And I've got some beautiful looking crops out there. So it's a matter of making sure the biology is working. So I guess my conclusion to that little part, my little soapbox rant there, modern agriculture grows plants from the soil. Regenerative agriculture grows soil from the plants. Okay, that's a big difference. It's a complete mind shift. And not only that, we need a polyculture of plants. Okay, the more different types of plants you can have out in your field, the more difference the roots are, right? A different type of plant will produce a different type of sugar and a different, feed a different type of bug. So a polyculture of everything is what we need. So the more plants you have, the more root systems you have, and the more soil life you're going to have. And then you're going to get more fertility out of that. So very important to get that polyculture. So I have said this for many, many years now, that a monoculture is ugly. If you've ever heard the song, "She Ain't Pretty, She Just Looks That Way," well, that's what all these monoculture crops are to me. Everybody says they look pretty, but they're not. If you're a bee, why do you don't want flowers one time of the year? You go ask a bee producer. They love dandelion. They love thistle. They love every type of plant. Sweet clover. A lot of people hate sweet clover, but boy, the bee people love it. So do I. Because that's a polyculture of root systems that I'm trying to get, all those different types of roots to build soil. Oh, I had to throw in one joke here. This is the latest edition of Play Bee magazine. So in case you're snickering, I can't tell if you're snickering, but I am. So I'm going to keep it in there. So just as a quick example, when I seed something down, I don't have a lot of equipment. I've been ranching for 23 years now, I think, something like that. And I've never owned a tractor. I do everything with trucks or quads or smaller equipment. So this is what I call a broadcast and trample. I took over a grain field a few years back, and I just spread the seed out. So I had a mixture of different types of seeds. I think there was 21 different seeds in this mixture. I drove around with this little quad mounted spreader, but I just had it on the back of my truck because then I could carry all the seed and you could easily refill it. And this was going on to canola stubble. So I zipped around there and I spread it. I had to do it twice because I had to do it once with the little seeds and once with the big seeds. And then what we did was we turned the livestock out to graze it. Now that's pretty well all volunteer canola that you can see growing. Okay, so I'm trying to convert this into a perennial polyculture. We got them to graze it down and they trampled it in, right? They grazed everything that was growing, but they also pushed all my seeds and basically harrowed it into the ground. This was on about June 5th, and then we let it grow. And we came back in early fall, and this is what it looked like. Okay, we had no added fertility. We used no chemicals. We used almost no equipment. And this is the crop that we got. Now, we got some rain. Right? That was a good year for rain. If we had a drought year, it wouldn't look near this good, obviously, but in comparison, where did the fertility come from? Okay, everybody in modern agriculture is so hung up on fertilizer that we got to add to the soil. Because remember that modern thinking of the time that my buddy there in 1634 had? We still believe today that plants grow from the soil, right? They eat up the soil, they use up the soil, and we have to replace it. Okay, so our thinking in agriculture has not changed since 1634. It's incredible to me that we're that far behind, we're that backwards still, because we don't need fertilizers, right? Like I said before, the air we breathe is 78% nitrogen. Why would you ever buy any? So obviously I did not need to add any nitrogen to this field. So the difference between the soil types, this was two comparisons at our place. The one on the left was obviously our land, and the one on the right was the neighbors across the fence from us. They did a continuous grazing, we did a regenerative grazing. Clear difference. The one on the left is almost 11% organic matter, and the one on the right is only 4%. And very similar land. This was actually the land that the University of Alberta did the carbon sequestration study on. So they selected these two fields because they were similar topography, history, everything else. The only difference was 12 years earlier, we started regenerative grazing on this land. So academia is still behind. Academia, universities, colleges still teach that it takes over 100 years to grow an inch of topsoil. I had a university researcher like 2 weeks ago make the comment to me that, oh yeah, but to grow an inch of soil, it takes you 100 years. And I'm like, no, it doesn't. In 12 years, we grew 3 inches of topsoil. So that means we're doing an inch every 4 years, not 100 years. We can do it way faster than what everybody thinks in academia. So we have to use the livestock to manage those plants and then keep that carbon flow going. Dr. Christine Jones out of Australia calls it the liquid carbon pathway, that carbon coming from the air through the plants, out the roots and into the soil. And we're trying to bind that up into the aggregates and hold on to it. We're actually the only industry on the planet that has the ability to be carbon positive, right? To be able to sequester more carbon than we emit. Somebody mentioned the other day, well, what about forestry? Well, forestry does too, but it takes a long time to build a forest, right, to grow it. And if a fire comes along, boom, that carbon's back in the air, right? It's instantly gone. So it's not stable. And fires are very common, right? Whereas if it's in the soil, if we can build that and build that organic matter into the soil, a fire could come along and we still hold it, right? It'll burn the residue on the top, but it won't burn down underneath. So we can hold on to it. So that's a very stable place to store carbon. Another friend of mine, well, no, not really again, 1840, Carl, he created what's called the law of the minimum, and it's all about fertility. So you see this in any fertilizer dealer, they always have this thing pinned on the wall. The idea behind it is that your plants or your crop will only grow to the extent of your most limiting nutrient, right? You might call it the weakest link, or what is the weakest link here. So I think it's hilarious they use this barrel, because they want you to look at all these fertilizers in here and say, well, you need P2O5, right? That's your weakest link. That's where you're gonna lose out on. And I just laugh whenever I see this barrel, because the weakest link, it's pouring out of the barrel. It's water, H2O, right? And I've had people argue with me, well, water's not a nutrient. Yes, it is. What's the difference between P2O5 and H2O? It's a nutrient. There was a conference I was at quite a few years back, and the fellow was saying that if you get a soil test back, and it says to grow X number of bushels of grain or X number tons of silage or whatever you're trying to grow, and the soil test report is saying that you need 50 pounds of nitrogen, equivalent to that 50 pounds of nitrogen, you need 10,000 pounds of water, right? That blew me away. I'm like, wow, that's awesome. Water is by far your most important nutrient, right? It's the only one I manage on my ranch. I do not manage any other nutrients, just water, because then I get my carbon and I get my nitrogen, and then the biology can find me everything else, right? Remember, the plant is made up of 97.5% of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen, okay? It only leaves 2.5%. So in the soil itself, the biology only has to get me 2.5%. Not that hard to do. Not that hard to do. Now, the problem is if you're adding fertilizers all the time, you're killing your biology. Now the plants don't get it. Now it's hard to do. So we got to keep that biology alive. And water is the number one thing that I manage on my ranch. So we're going to look at 5 grazing principles here. Number 1, of course, being the water cycle, but they all work together to do this whole system, right? We can't just look at water and say that's the only thing we can do, but there is 5 principles that I look at. So when I'm planning for a drought, you have to think of effective rainfall, not actual rainfall. So I guess a little bit of a description of a drought here first. A drought is relative. Okay, if you're in an area where you get normally in a growing season 30 inches of rainfall, right? Your plants are accustomed to that environment and that amount of moisture. Let's say you get 15 inches of rain. You're in a severe drought, right? You only got half of what you normally get. So those plants that are there are going to suffer. So you're going to be affected as the farmer. Now, if you're in an area where you normally get 6 inches of rainfall, okay, I know lots of people that are in those zones. Now, if they get 3 inches, right, they're in a severe drought. It's the same thing, it's 50%. But their plants that are in that environment are used to only getting 6% or 6 inches of rain. So we're in a relative. So when someone says that, oh, we're in a drought, we only got 15 inches, and then somebody else complains that, oh, that's nothing. I dreamed to have 15 inches. Well, it's relative. Okay, that guy in a 6-inch rainfall, when he gets 8, he's ecstatic, right? He's supercharged. So we got to keep that in mind, right? Your environment's different than mine. Just to be clear, my area where I'm at here by Busby, Alberta, I normally in a growing season, I get 15 inches of rainfall. Okay, so the last 2 years we've got way over that. We were 20 and 25, I think. I mean, we had a couple of really, really wet years. This year we were in a drought. We only got 4. So 4 out of 15. So that's a pretty severe drought. That being said, a drought can be managed. Okay, it's the effective rainfall that I'm after, not the actual rainfall. The effective rainfall is what your plants get to use. And through management, we can change that. We can improve that. So just a real simple way to explain that, the land that I've been managing for over 15 to 20 years, remember I said back in 2002, I started planning for droughts because that's what my mentor told me to. So the land that I've been planning for a drought for that many years wasn't in a drought this summer. We only got 4 inches of rain, but it did well. We didn't destock. The animals went home about maybe 3 weeks ago, right? We kept them late. I haven't calculated out all my animal days yet, but we're very similar to the previous year, right? It was not in a drought, that land. Right next to it, my neighbors, they were feeding by July. Okay, so that effective rainfall is so important. In a wet year, I give back, right? I leave lots of residue. I'm trying to build that water holding capacity. I'm trying to leave residue, build the soil so that on the bad year, we can take more and still be okay, right? We're not going to hurt our soil. So we've got to plan for that every year. And the best time to plan for a drought is on the good year, right? That's when I put more back. I always say when nature gives to me, I give back. And if they don't give, well, then I take more. It's kind of like a bank account, right? You want to always keep your bank account positive, right? So on a good year, I make deposits. And then on a bad year, when you've got a drought, I can take some withdrawals, be a little harder on it, graze it right to the ground, right? Not overgraze it, definition difference there. But I can take all the residue and I'm still okay because I've got a nice thatch layer there, that nice soil armor that I've built up over the years. So yeah, a big difference between effective rainfall and actual rainfall. Now, if you're in a really wet environment, same thing. If we can manage the water and the water holding capacity and the infiltration, same thing. We're building those root systems. We're allowing them to dig down. We can do this exact same management and benefit in a wet year. Okay, because on a wet year, you can get flooding. Whereas if you've got a good, healthy soil, it absorbs it and infiltrates down and fills up. One of the best stories I ever have for a presentation, back in 2015, we had a severe drought here as well. And we'd been managing the land for quite a while. and no runoff, right? There was no winter snow, very little, and basically no runoff. The dugouts were all empty. Like it was pretty severe. And everybody was starting to complain and cry, and we're out of pasture and dugouts were empty. And then all of a sudden, middle to end of July, we got 5 inches in a day. 5 inches came down, just boom. I remember there was videos of people canoeing and kayaking in the parking lot in town at the grocery store, right? The parking lot was right full, so they were kayaking across it. So pretty wet. So everybody was cheering, yay, our dugouts are going to fill up. And we went out to our dugouts the next day, and they came up about a foot. I remember the one in particular that I went to that was pretty low. It barely came up. And over time, it took about 2 weeks, and that dugout was overflowing out the backside. Okay, so what had happened is that water absorbed into the ground. We held onto it, and it soaked through slowly, so the plants get to use it, and then it filled the dugout from the bottom up, and then it was overflowing out the back. Right, it was amazing to see. If you ever see that healthy water cycle working, that's very rewarding. Right, thumbs up if you can see that. So that's how we're going to be planning for a drought. We need to plan well in advance. So let's talk about the water cycle quick. Soil moisture can be lost in 4 ways. Okay. Runoff. Runoff is, obviously the rain comes down, it doesn't penetrate through, and it's running off your land. Now there's ways to get less runoff. If we could cover the soil, that's a huge step forward in allowing that water to stay on your land. If you ever get a chance, or if you have seen a rainfall simulator, that is a fantastic demonstration. If you haven't seen one, it'll blow you away. It's amazing the difference between the different types of soil management with that rainfall simulator. It's really cool. So let's look at the soil surface on a microscopic level. Okay, we got one raindrop coming down. Okay, it comes down, and if it hits bare soil, it's like a hand grenade going off, a small explosion. And that little hand grenade explodes and breaks the soil aggregates apart, right? Little clumps. It'll break them apart into fine particles of silt, sand, and clay, right? You end up getting this smooth surface. You've all seen the cracking out in a drought, right? The soil is bare and then it cracks. Well, before it cracks, it's this smooth surface that the second raindrop coming down can't penetrate through, right? It hits it and it can't go through. So where is it going to go? It's got to run off. Okay. So in this case, the raindrop is stronger than the soil, right? And it breaks the soil apart. So what we need to do is have live or dead plant material above it so that it protects the soil. We call it the soil armor. This raindrop now comes down. It comes down and hits live or dead plant. Remember I said the plants are the mob? Right? They're tough guys, right? They're really tough. Now that raindrop hits a plant and it breaks the raindrop apart, not the plant. Now the raindrop breaks into tiny little particles, and then it soaks down into the soil gently. Not that explosion doesn't happen because we've got that soil armor. So we need that live or dead plant material to protect it so that we don't have those impacts of those raindrops, and that reduces our runoff. So very important. If you see bare soil, not a good thing, right? Cropland, pasture land, you name it. The only bare soil I will admit that I see on my land is the mole hills. We do have moles, so they natural tillage a little bit here and there, but it makes it a little rough driving across some of the pastures, but that's acceptable. The other way we can lose moisture is through evaporation. Okay, so now once we got some moisture in the soil, that moisture doesn't move by gravity anymore, right? Rainfall comes down by gravity, but once it's in the soil, it now moves by diffusion. Diffusion is a movement from an area of greater concentration to an area of lesser concentration. So in this case, wet to dry. So let's say we've got some moisture in our soil, the wind's blowing across, the sun's beating down on it, and the top layer will evaporate because that's what water does. It evaporates into the atmosphere. Now, the moisture, because the soil is just dry on top, moisture will start to move up. Okay, it'll move up from down below, and then it'll evaporate. And then more moisture will move up, and then it'll evaporate. So we're creating a negative or a backwards water cycle. Okay, so we're evaporating out of the soil. It'll go up into the clouds, condensate, and then it will precipitate down. And now because we don't have any soil armor, we'll get runoff. That runoff will head off into our water bodies, our dugouts, our sloughs, our lakes, our rivers. And with it usually takes some erosion, right? It takes all the organic matter with it, and then fills your dugouts from above ground. Okay, that's what everybody else's dugouts do. Now, a healthy water cycle, we have moisture evaporating from our lakes and rivers and streams, forming clouds, precipitating down, soaking into the ground, and then filling our water sources from below ground, like I just described. Okay, so that's a healthy water cycle. That's what we want, and that's what we're trying to build. That makes a huge difference in our landscapes and in our management. So evaporation is very important. So how do we stop the evaporation? Cover the ground. Same thing, right? We got two birds with one stone here. If you leave that residue there so the sun can't hit the soil and the wind can't touch the soil, we've got the same job. We stop two things. We reduce the runoff and reduce the evaporation. So very powerful, that residue. I can't say enough how important leaving that residue is. The third way is infiltration. Okay, so we just said that infiltration is a good thing. It soaks down through the soil profile and fills our water bodies from underneath. Now, we don't want it to go too fast, right? If you've got a really sandy soil, that can happen like instantly, right? You know, it rains today and tomorrow it's bone dry again. So we want to make sure we build enough soil so that we can hold on to that water. And if we get excess, yes, it'll infiltrate out, but we want to be able to slow it down so it doesn't just take off on you. So number 4, oops, too far. Plant utilization. Okay, that's what we want. That's actually our effective rainfall right there, number 4, what the plants get to use. So the difference between actual rainfall and effective rainfall is 1, 2, and 3 versus number 4. Okay, we want to reduce runoff. We want to have infiltration so that our plants get to use as much of that water as you can. Okay, so that's what we're aiming for. And you can't do this, you know, in this year. You have to do this well in advance. This is a long-term ongoing thing. It's not a magic bullet. It's not going to happen next year. We've got to have a continual drought plan in place. Along with that goes riparian area management. Okay, we need to hold on to moisture. We need water bodies. I don't know about your area, but a lot of our land is being bulldozed and ditched and drained and trenched, and we're losing all of our riparian areas. There's a whole nother part to this riparian area that I'm going to talk about soon. But just the fact that the water's there, that we're giving a place for that hydration to stay, right? It affects rainfall. If all the water runs away and drains away, there's nothing to evaporate. So we need to have these water bodies around, and not only for the environment and insects and species. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit, but just to make sure we have that water in our area, in our zone. Don't let it all run away. I would gladly give up 10, 20, 30% of my land, right, to water just to have it, because it's that important to me. So most people don't like the beaver. Well, I pretend to be the beaver. I like to dam things up. There's lots of land that I've taken over where you can see 30 years ago, 20 years ago, whenever, however long, that a farmer dug it out, ditched it away so that this little area would drain, right? Then they could farm through it. Well, I go in there and I plug them up again. I block them off, and I create dams, and I build little areas that'll hold water. It's part of my plan is to try and hold as much water. And boy, that sure shines on a year like this, when I've still got water and I'm still pumping water to my animals and everybody else is out of water, right? So to me, that's really important to be able to look at that and eyeball it and say, yeah, that's a good spot. We're going to hold on to that. We built a riparian area on a spring runoff area. So it's not technically a creek. So, but we basically created a creek out of it that's standing water, very steep slopes, and just so where the runoff comes in the spring. And we created this long kind of, it looks like a river, but it's just a long dam backup now. And now all of a sudden the beavers moved in to help me. They're going to make it bigger, and it doesn't take over a whole bunch of land because it's in a very steep coulee. And if that beaver keeps building it up and up and up and up, I'd be very happy, because he's got a long way to go before it ever overflows over any banks. It's probably 30 to 40 feet high until it ever overflows into my pasture lands and stuff. So I enjoy going around looking for spots on where I can make water bodies. That's my goal. I did buy, I think I told you at the beginning, I don't own a tractor, but I did a few years ago buy a backhoe, and that's exactly why I did it. So I can dig holes and dig, build dams and hold water. That's the reason I have it. I love this quote. The quote's actually a lot longer than this, but this is all I pulled out of it to put on the screen here. Once the soil was deep, it absorbed and kept the water, and this water soaked into the hills and fed springs and running streams everywhere. Now, abandoned shrines at these dried up springs attest that the description of the land is true. So he's basically describing a broken water cycle, that it used to be nice and now it's broken. And this was Plato. He was describing his beloved Greece. And he lived back in 427 BC to 347 BC before Christ was born. So well over 2,000 years ago, we knew about a broken water cycle. We knew that things didn't work when you messed with the water cycle. But we haven't learned. We still haven't learned. History is amazing to look at, and it's confuses me why we don't learn from history. Okay, water cycle. One of the most important parts of my business, obviously, is just building that, holding on to that water. Number 2 in our grazing principles is sunlight harvesting. Okay, now we're going to get back to photosynthesis. Very important. It might sound kind of silly, but I'm in the business of capturing sunbeams, right? My job is to capture as many sunbeams as I can. It might seem kind of like a children's story, but that's what I do. I capture sunbeams. We talked a little bit about it already, how that's the basics of life. That's the sugar, that's the currency that everybody uses. And the glucose molecule that the chloroplasts of the plants make, they pull the carbon out of the air and use hydrogen and oxygen to make that glucose molecule. It's the building block to just about every enzyme, every protein, everything that we have in our environment, right? That's the start of life. So we need to get as much of it as we can. I heard a quote here a while ago. It's funny. I'm not going to get the numbers quite perfect, but the sunlight just traveled 700 million miles to get to us. Don't waste it in the last 4 inches. Kind of makes you think, 4 inches, what's that? That means cover the ground. Cover the ground and have a living plant there to absorb that sunbeam. If it hits dirt, it gets reflected. When the university came out and did the carbon sequestration study on my land, they had a drone that they flew, and what they were doing was measuring albedo. Albedo is the amount of light that comes down versus the amount of light that gets reflected back up. So there's sensors on the top of it and there's sensors on the bottom of it. So they're measuring the difference. So if you've got a really good, actively growing, thick crop, you're not going to lose much, right? It's going to absorb a much of that. If you've got a sparse crop with lots of bare ground showing, you're going to get lots of reflected back. So the more you absorb, the better, right? I think that's a really cool term to think about, that you got to increase your albedo, not your libido. Don't get that wrong, albedo. So how do we do that? We got to increase the time that we're collecting sunlight, right? If we're going to be doing carbon sequestration, and I'd like to change that term a little bit. I'd like to add the word net in front of it, net carbon sequestration, because we have to be, sequestering more than we're emitting in the process, or why are we doing this? Okay, so we have to increase the time. So how many days out of the year are you collecting sunlight, right? Depending on your environment where you are, we have maybe 120-day growing season, but I might still get to sequester carbon for maybe up to 200 days, right? Because those plants out there right now, just before the snow, I still had green plants out there, right? A little bit of green, it's still collecting. I bet those roots are still putting a little bit of sugar out for those soil organisms. So we got to increase the time. We also have to increase the density. I want to cover all the soil. I want to cover that. And I want to increase the leaf area, right? To capture as many sunbeams as I can. So let me explain those a little bit more. So time. I'm going to try and lengthen the growing season, but I don't really have control of, when that killing frost comes, and I don't have control of, when that temperature warms up in the spring. But I can get as much of it as I possibly can, try to get as much of it as I can. Let's talk about the spring first. I want to favor the grass to get an early spring start. Okay, as soon as the temperature's ready, that ground warms up, and I want my plants jumping out of the ground, right? I want them just jumping. So here's a fence line photo at our place. Greener Pastures Ranching, obviously on the close side of the fence, and my neighbors on the back side. If we zoom in just a hair, okay, so take a look at his pasture versus mine. I've got 6 to 8 inches of healthy green grass growing, and he's barely started, right? He's got some dandelions out there that are just barely coming up. By the way, we both turned out on approximately the same day. This was May 15th, quite a few years ago, but I remember it was May 15th. I turned out 250 cow-calf pairs onto about a 20-acre field, and then I did my rotation, and he turned about 25 cow-calf pairs onto a quarter section, so 160 acres. Little different management. So what do I see in this picture? I see little tiny dandelions. They're already in flower on May 15th. I mean, the bees are probably appreciating that at that time, but I've seen dandelion plants that leaves are 1 foot to 2 feet long, right? Big voluptuous plants that are growing, and right, these plants don't want to go to seed when they're this small. They don't produce very many seeds then. Their goal is to be as big and as voluptuous as they can get and produce as many seeds as they can. This little tiny dandelion plant that's only a half an inch tall and it's already going to flower, that's telling me it's a very desperate plant, right? It's desperate. It's trying to go to seed, just put out a few just to survive. Okay, not a healthy system. On my side, well, one, you don't even see the dandelions. I do have dandelions, but just not in this picture. But if you do see them, they're a lot bigger. They're huge. But my plants aren't desperate. Right, they've got lots of nutrients, they've got lots of water, they're doing fine, so they don't have to go to seed yet. The other thing in the picture here is the urine spots. You see the little green patches. Okay, that's the benefit from the nitrogen from the urine from last year, right? So that's where all the cattle peed. Where are the urine patches on my side, right? Did my cows not pee last year? No, it's that I've got a good healthy nutrient cycling going, and that added nitrogen doesn't make that much of effect because I already have enough in there that it just blends in, and it's it doesn't have that greening effect. So pretty important to keep that whole system working and the biology working, and that way we get that early spring start. I also want the plants not overgrazed from the year before, right? I want those root reserves full and ready to grow. As soon as the temperature's warm enough, I want my plants jumping out of the ground. Okay. How about late season growth? Okay, this is the same fence line photo in the fall. We're getting maybe late August here. Across the fence, we've got a bunch of Canada thistle, pretty mature, it's already in flower. We've got a bunch of stage 3 grasses in the background that are mature and gone to seed, so they're not collecting sunlight anymore. And in between, we've probably got a bunch of little tiny grasses that have been chewed off all summer and have probably gone dormant by now. Whereas on my side, I've got some actively growing, stage 2 growth plants actively collecting sunlight, right? So I'm just collecting more sunlight than him. The more sunbeams I collect, the better. So I'm trying to do that on all my land. Okay, and I also want to increase the rate of growth throughout the whole season by maintaining those plants in the optimum stage of growth. Okay, so there's 3 stages of growth. Stage 1 is really short. The plant's just getting established. Stage 2 is actively collecting sunlight, growing. It's in the vegetative state. And then stage 3 is seed maturity. So it's going to go to seed. Once it starts going to seed, it doesn't need to collect much sun anymore. It's yellowing off, and we're not being very efficient at collecting sunbeams. Okay, so if I can, I'm going to try and keep my plants in stage 2 for most of the summer. That's where our rotation comes in. You don't want to let it quite get to the point where it's going to seed. You want to knock it down and graze it back, and then let it regrow again. Get the animals off, let it regrow. Kind of like making hay, right? When you make hay, you let it grow. You don't want it to get mature. You want to cut it before maturity. So you cut it all down in, hopefully one day, and get it baled up and gone. And then you let it grow again. Okay, that's all I'm doing with my pastures, but I just have a whole bunch of little fields, and I can't park my equipment in the shed while everything grows. So you've got to because they got to eat every day. So you have to do a rotation to make all these little hay fields and knock them down and let them grow. Okay, so it's the same idea. Difference is that the hayfield doesn't get the animal impact or the stock density, the benefits that we'll talk about in a little while. So I also want to manage for drought. Obviously, we just talked about that, but I might get an extra 2 weeks of growth when my neighbor doesn't. Okay, if his plants, we get a dry period, maybe a month without any rain, maybe after 2 weeks, his plants go dormant and he loses 2 weeks of growing season because of a dry and a non-effective rainfall. But my plants grow right through that, right? I can probably go a month and a half to 2 months with zero precipitation and my plants still grow. Depends on the pasture, but yeah, they'll still keep growing. Drought resilience is an important part of what I do. And the increased nutrients availability. We talked about those urine patches, right? We want to make sure that we've got a good nutrient recycling, the entire system there working, the biology there working to get you the nutrients, and then you don't need to add fertility, right? We've got a good healthy soil and we're actively collecting sunlight because there's nothing missing. So that's important to me. Okay, let's bump on to nutrient recycling. Matter cannot be created or destroyed. Okay, it's a law, the law of conservation of mass. When anything happens, we just change forms, right? In fire, it's just changing forms. It's combusting and all those elements get switched into a different form. Water can be hydrogen and it can be oxygen in the air, or it can convert and join together and become rain, right? It's just in a different part of the cycle. Carbon has a cycle, nitrogen has a cycle. You cannot destroy it or you cannot create it. So when people complain that we've got too much carbon in the air, it's not a shortage or it's not too much in the air. It's just that we've got too much in the wrong part of the cycle, right? There's a fixed amount on this planet. Same with water shortages, right? It's not that we have a water shortage or flooding. It's not that we have too much water. It's that it's in the wrong part of the cycle, right? We've messed up the water cycle. So yeah, we need to be able to manage these cycles, and everything has a cycle, a zinc cycle, a manganese cycle, copper cycle. They all cycle around. The big thing in agriculture is though that we need that ruminant animal to help with this recycling. Most other systems are not. Think of a grazing system. A cow is very inefficient. A sheep is very inefficient. A goat is very inefficient. About 80% of what they eat comes out the back end. Okay, that's from a human standpoint, we would never build a machine that is 80% inefficient. Okay, but the point is it's not for the benefit of the livestock. Okay, I consider the livestock to be working for me. Okay, their job is to recycle nutrients. Okay, so what they're eating, I want the plant material recycled, and I'll pay you 20% off the top. Right, you get to keep 20% of it. I get 80% out the back end. That's the deal I have with them. So that's what we need the mentality of. Most modern agriculture, like think of haying or grain farming, we're exporting 80 to 90% of the nutrients off the land all the time, right? We're exporting it, taking it somewhere else. Not a regenerative system, not recycling nutrients. We're exporting. Now we have to pay to bring it in. I'm not saying we have to stop all grain farming and all haying, because remember I said 97.5% of every plant comes from the air anyway. So we're only exporting off that 2.5%. But we're going to run out of copper. We're going to run out of stuff eventually. But that being said, with that biology, they have the amazing ability to get it for us anyway. There's a big difference between available nutrients in the soil test versus the unavailable nutrients. Okay, you have multiple lifetimes worth of every nutrient in your soil. It's just not available, or it's deeper. Right? So we need different plants, different root systems to be able to get it. And we need the biology to be able to work with them to get it for you. Okay, so you shouldn't ever run out of nutrients in multiple lifetimes, even if you're harvesting it off as grain and hay, because as long as we've got that biology, they can get it. But now, obviously, we want to be regenerative or sustainable for generations. So that's where we need to recycle more. We need to get more livestock recycling this nutrients. So you don't want to take hay every year. You want to graze it part of the time, right? You want to get some animals out there recycling it. And same with grain. You don't want to be taking grain every year. You want to be recycling it some of the times. Get a cattle out there and at least graze the residues. Put in some cover crops and have that as part of your rotation. So we need to integrate that in all parts of livestock, is this recycling concept. So this is not a very good recycling picture. Okay, this one is drying up and it's not decomposing. Okay, I would like to see a cow patty or a sheep manure or goats or chicken manure. I want to see it decomposing, breaking down. We need, doesn't matter what type of animal you run, my 2 donkeys and my llama run as a herd. Okay, I need their poop. I need it spread out. I need it moving around. But from there, I also need the biology to start breaking it down. Okay, so this is only part way. It's partially decomposed when it comes out the back end of the animal. We need to get it the rest of the way. So that's when biology comes in. So how do we build biology? There's biology all over my farm. Okay, there's biology under the soil and there's biology above the soil. There's big ones and there's little ones. And I'm trying to work with all of them. And they're all my employees. They work for room and board. Okay, I got to give them a place to live. I got to give them food and water. And they work tirelessly for me. They never take a day off. They never take a sick day. They basically work until they die. Pretty good employees, I tell you, pretty dedicated. Let's look at a few of them. 1 cup of healthy soil has over 6 billion organisms in it. Okay, that's a lot. So we got a lot of critters there. To get 2.5%, the reason it's so easy for them is because there's so many of them, or could be so many of them. Let's look at a few real quick. Bacteria. There's millions and millions of different types of bacteria, but there's 4 basic types. There's decomposers. They're going to be, recycling your manure and your residue and your any extra material you leave behind. There's mutualists. These are bacteria in the soil that deal with that black market. Okay, they're constantly trading with the plants. They're bringing that molecule of nitrogen, giving it to the plant in exchange for a molecule of sugar. Okay, so there's lots of those. There's pathogens. There's lots of. It's like a war zone down there. It's a bug eat bug world, right? There's bad bugs and good bugs that eat bad bugs and bad bugs that eat good bugs. It's this little whole ecosystem down there of bug eat bug world. So that's not always a bad thing, but some of them are pathogens. And litrotrophs, they help with nitrogen cycling, so we're getting nitrogen out of the air, and pollutant degradation. Okay, so they can decompose pollutants, poisons, some of the chemicals we use. There are bacteria out there that will decompose it. So those are 4 basic types. But if they're helping to decompose some of that material and they're building organic matter for me, they're doing a great job at helping me with that water cycle as well. Another employee, a very important employee on my ranch, is the Orbuscular Mycorrhizae Fungi. Okay, the way this works is this fungus that grows in your soil attaches to the root hairs. Okay, it forms a symbiotic relationship with plants, and in exchange for sugar, just like with the bacteria, the plant will give the mycorrhizae fungi sugar in exchange for other materials. And this is the internet and the transportation and distribution system of the soil. Okay, it's like little semis driving back and forth, hauling stuff back and forth. That's what this mycorrhizae fungi does. It can haul nutrients from a long ways away. It's really good. The big thing in agriculture is we're always having trouble getting phosphorus. It's always bound up. Mycorrhizae fungi is really good at finding and delivering phosphorus to the plants. So should never have a shortage of phosphorus as long as you got mycorrhizae fungi in your soil. So if you can picture this, the one on the left-hand side here is just the plant and the root system. On the right-hand side is the root system when the mycorrhizae fungi attaches to it. Okay, it can extend the reach of the plant 1,000-fold. You know how many more nutrients and minerals you can get if you have mycorrhizae fungi in your soil? Okay, we're just going to suck that in. And in a drought year or in a drought time, it'll actually transport water to the plants. So can you imagine how much better your plants will do in a drought if it can reach 1,000 times more distance to get water? Okay, really important. Mycorrhizae fungi is something they didn't even know about until I think it was about the 1980s. Right? They didn't even know it existed because we kill it off. Right? Agriculture soils kill it off. They knew about it in a rainforest, that there's this network of fungus underneath the ground that connects all the trees together and helps them communicate and talk to one another. Well, we have it we're supposed to have it in our agricultural soils too. So to me, mycorrhizae fungi is one of the most important underground employees I have. So I'm going to take care of it. Adding fertility actually puts this guy out of a job. If his job is to bring phosphorus to the plant in exchange for sugar, if you give free phosphorus to the plant, well, that puts him out of a job. This guy's out of a job and he'll die and shrivel up because the plant says, well, I don't need phosphorus, so I don't need to give you any sugar. And then when the drought comes along, there's no mycorrhizae fungi, so the plant doesn't get any moisture, right? So the plant's not very, doesn't have much foresight, not looking ahead. So, and that carbon we were talking about in the carbon sequestration model, we've got photosynthesis that pulls it out of the air, we've got exudation that puts it into the ground, and then we've got mycorrhizae fungi that can convert that into glomalin. And I've actually, sorry, I've spelt that wrong on there, glomalin. Now, it is a very stable form of carbon in the soil. Okay, it takes decades to break down. Once it's formed, it's there for a long time. So if we're trying to hold on to carbon, boy, this is a very important part of that carbon sequestration game that we're playing. And that's the, like I said before, the frustrating part to me. People think they're gonna, solve climate change with reducing a little bit of carbon emissions, right? We're gonna drive to work tomorrow because, sorry, we're gonna ride our bike to work tomorrow instead of driving, so we're gonna do our bit. No, it's a net, right? We need to make sure we are sequestering more than we're emitting. So that's a new term I'd like you to think about. Instead of just saying, yeah, carbon sequestration, how about we talk about net carbon sequestration? I'm a math guy, so I like to do, big number minus little number to make sure we're in the positive. So, okay. Earthworms. How does that affect the water cycle? Well, they do tunnels in the ground, right? They recycle the dung and the plant material, help build that organic matter for water holding capacity. Microbes love earthworms. The slime that an earthworm puts out, right? That's heaven for a microbe. So there'll be 100 times more microbes in the soil if you've got earthworms. But they create paths in the ground. They dig down and they have the roots can follow them. The moisture can infiltrate down through, and the air can get down there. Earthworms are great for our soil, and they buffer the soil. Anything that comes out the back end of an earthworm is pH neutral. So if it's acidic soil or basic soil, that's their job, is to help buffer the soil. Okay, dung beetles. How many people have dung beetles on their farm? They're very important as well. They help take that manure down. If you've got tunnelers, there's actually 3 different types of dung beetles. There's dwellers, tunnelers, and rollers. So your dwellers just kind of stay around the pat and just put the dung balls just below the surface, and that's where their larvae grow. A tunneler will drill down and dig deep into the ground a few feet, and that'll help with infiltration, water infiltration. And the tunnelers will take the rollers will grab a ball of manure, roll it away, and bury it in a hole somewhere else. So they're moving nutrients around. They're helping get rid of parasites, right? If they decompose the manure, they also take the fly larvae and things like that. Very beneficial to our system. One more joke for you. So it's a dung beetle bar. Is that all there is to life? We eat, poo, and die? He says, the bartender says, pretty much. So I had to put a couple in. So some more biology. How about above ground? When a drought hits, everybody complains about grasshoppers. But this was a very powerful lesson for me too. This was again back in 2002. That was a good learning year for me, I tell you. We had a pretty bad drought then. And 2001 was the first year that I really did some serious bale grazing. So I was leaving bales out and grazing them in spots, and then all the residue would be left. So in 2002, when the drought hit, I had these circles of bale residue from the bale grazing out there. And the grasshoppers moved in, and man, they were eating everything. You could look at a fence post and there'd probably be 50 to 100 grasshoppers sitting on that sunny side of the fence post, right? It was thick. But all of these little bale grazing circles that I had, it was barley bales or barley green feed that I grazed that winter. These circles were standing 2 feet tall, and the grasshoppers didn't eat them. Right? Grasshoppers like barley, they'll attack a barley field, but they wouldn't go into these bale grazing circles. And what I did some investigating, and what I found out that there's this fungal disease. I'm not going to try and spell it, but you can read it there if you want. That kills grasshoppers. It's the #1 fatality of grasshoppers is this fungus. Now this fungus needs moisture, and grasshoppers instinctively know to stay away from moisture because they're a dryland critter, because this fungus will kill them. So there's all these little circles in my land where the grasshoppers wouldn't go in. And it dawned on me that summer that I know how to fence out grasshoppers. And I literally did. The drought of 2015, I could fence out grasshoppers. All I have to do is have more water holding capacity in my land than my neighbor has. And the grasshoppers stay in his field. right? I remember in 2015, we had the drought. My grass was growing nice. We had lots of it. Look across the fence and the neighbors, and the grasshoppers are eating everything. Okay, so very powerful learning lesson for me that we need that water holding capacity. Pests appear when conditions favor them. Okay, we just got to make sure the conditions are balanced, and then we don't have those pests come in major swarms. So yeah, you bet. That's a great lesson. That's a fungal predator is what it is. It's a predator that is only fungus. So cool, very cool. Fly larvae. We've been battling fly control in agriculture for, I don't know, 30, 40, 50 years, right? Every year we spend millions and millions of dollars on fly control. It's not working. It's not working. It never has, it never will. So what we need to do again is balance the system. These flies, larvae, they're doing a good thing for me. They're decomposing manure, just like the dung beetle, right? They're breaking that down for me. What I need though, again, is predators in this situation. I need something that eats the fly larvae before we get too many flies. I need some flies because I need this cycle to keep going, but I want a predator to eat them. So real quickly, cowbirds. I'll have flocks of, thousands and thousands of cowbirds flying around my herds. They're constantly eating bugs and critters and mosquitoes and flies and all sorts of stuff for me. Bats. I put up some bat houses on our property. I found a bunch around this one was hiding in the crevice of a door jamb. There was 3 of them here. And so I figured, hey, if they're going to be here to work for me, I better give them a home. So we put up a bunch of bat houses for them. So another important predator on my farm. Parasic wasp. They come in and they actually, one species anyway, will come in and sting a fly larvae in a manure, and that fly larvae will obviously die, and then they will deposit their larvae inside the fly larvae, and then it will grow and develop and become an adult parasitic wasp and fly away. So we have the fly larvae eating the manure, which is a good thing. We have the parasitic wasp larvae eating the fly larvae, and we don't get the flies. So we don't have a fly problem, right? It's a balancing of a system. It's not a controlling a system. That's the big difference. And lastly, polyculture. Okay, this is an important part of this. The polyculture, right at the beginning I said that, the polyculture of plants gives you a polyculture of roots, which will give you a polyculture of soil organisms, okay, and that's important. And in our environment, we get flowers at different times for the pollinators, okay, so we need this mixture. Again, the monoculture is ugly, right? There's many different species in here. There's all sorts of legumes and clovers underneath this. We've got broadleaf plants and narrowleaf plants and creeping grasses and bunch grasses, and very important to get a mixture of different type of root systems. So part of this, it always leads to weeds, okay? And people don't want weeds in their field. You go talk to a bee farmer, he loves the Canada thistle, he loves the dandelion, right? Those bees need that flower that's early in the season or late in the season to still be able to get some food from. So the beekeepers don't have to feed them all season long. And same with the soil organisms, right? We need a different type of root system that's pushing out exudate at a different time of the year, or a different type of exudate to feed those soil organisms. Usually what we consider a weed, I call it a pioneer species. And to me, they're there to heal the land. Okay, very important job that they have to do. If there's some damage to it, that plant is there. If it's taken over a field, obviously something's out of balance. It's favoring that one too much. So we need to change our management. Maybe you've got a bacterial dominated soil, so more weeds come in. Maybe you're on the other end where you've got saplings coming in all the time, right? Lots of trees and saplings coming in and you can't control them. They're getting out of hand. Well, there you've got a fungal dominated soil. Okay, we need a balance between the two. So we need to be able to manage and change things to balance that out. But I'm not going to get into my weed talk here today. But it's very important to understand that there's no such thing as a weed in nature, right? They all have a purpose. They have something to do. If you do want to read a little bit more about this, the best article ever written on weed management, this young lady wrote it. You can find it on the Canadian Cattlemen website if you Google Dana Kenyon. I'm not biased at all. My daughter, she was 12 years old when she wrote it, and she got published in the Canadian Cattlemen magazine and the Stockman Grass Farmer magazine. So if you want to find out more about that, yeah, called Just Another Weed Hugger. So that was her title for her article. It was really well written. I was very proud of her. Oops. Okay. How are we doing for time? When am I going to questions and answers?
We can go to them as soon as you like, or if you have more to go through in the presentation.
Okay. Okay, I'm going to go through these real quick then. Like, technically, what time is it? I don't have a clock in front of me here
it's 8:30 Eastern Standard.
And we're done at 9?
Yeah, we should. Well, we can keep.
Or are we supposed to be done at 8:30?
No, we're good to go, and we have people still interested. So, and I know Anita is monitoring the chat.
Okay, I will do these 5 real quick just to make sure you know I'm not going to really teach them tonight, but these are also very important. And then we'll go to question and answer. So, so we just talked about the grazing principles. I consider that the why, right? Why we're doing this. Why I'm going to do regenerative grazing is because I want to get a good water cycle. I want to collect as much sunlight, right? That's all the why things. Now we're going to do the how. This is the actual management of, the different things that we're going to do to be able to get those. So we need to manage the animals for a short graze period and a long rest period. Okay, they have to work together. Remember that hayfield that I talked about, how you let it grow, you cut it in one day and then you let it grow again? Well, that's what we're doing with the cattle. So depending on your environment, how long that graze period and that rest period could be. So you could have an environment where you've got plants regrowing again in a couple of days. So you want to have your animals off of it before then. Or you could, be in an environment where it takes a week or 2 weeks for those plants to regrow. So you could be on there a little bit longer. And for rest period, you might be in an area where, those plants grow so fast that in 25 days, they're almost going to seed already because they're growing that fast. Whereas in another environment, it might take 180 days to get it to actually want to go to seed. So it depends on your environment. The beauty of these concepts is you adjust them to your environment, okay, because they work in any environment. So we have to balance out our graze period and our rest period to make sure we're not overgrazing. That's a key point. We've also got animal impact. Animal impact, I used to talk about it all the time as the physical stimulation on the soil by the animal's hooves, right? They could step on that capped soil and break it open to allow water to go through it. They could push that nutrient or that material to the ground so that the biology could get a hold of it to be able to break it down. They could, kind of move the soil around to get seed to soil contact, right? There's all these physical things that the animals can do, but there's also a biological impact. Okay, there's food or there's food for biology. There's biology or there's food for biology that comes out of the manure, the urine. It comes off their hair coat. It comes out of their phlegm and their saliva as they're grazing, right? All this is part of the biology. There's a symbiotic relationship between the biology in the soil and the biology in the ruminant. Okay, very important that I missed that for many, many years. I didn't understand that, and that's an important part of it. Stock density is important. That's how tightly together your animals are grazing. So how grouped up they are. Are they grazing, 100 head on an acre for a day, or are they, 100 head on 100 acres for 4 months? Okay, that's the difference between high stock density and low stock density. The big benefits to that, high stock density will give you better plant utilization, which means every plant is either knocked down or cut or damaged in some way, just like that haybine going across, right? Every plant gets cut, makes an even playing field for everything to regrow. The other one is better manure distribution. So manure and urine get spread around the field and that nutrient cycling is better. So the higher the stock density, the better both those are. And then we kind of talked a little bit about it already. The fifth one is that soil armor, leaving residue. To me, I missed that for a lot of years too, because I would take, I was trying to raise a family as a young farmer getting going, and you graze every paddock a little bit harder and take another couple of days off every paddock. That's another $1,000 or more at the end of the year. But if you're not leaving enough residue, it hurts you the following years. Okay, so the phrase I always use is leave as much residue as you can cash flow. Right, I understand years that high hay prices and running out of pasture early, but leave as much as you can. Right, it's kind of like a cash flow thing. Short-term cash flow now, what can I get out of it, versus long-term sustainability. How much am I going to get years to come because of I'm putting in it? Again, that bank account. The more you put in now, the more you're going to get back later. So we can probably shut that down now. By all means, there's way more to learn about graze period, rest period, animal impact, stock density, and soil armor, but I think we can move to questions now and see what anybody has to say. I'd like to see some faces too, if possible.
Perfect, and thank you very much for that informative presentation. Can't wait to get that up to the OSF YouTube channel, and hopefully some producers who were not able to make it tonight can listen in, or if anyone wants to listen back. That being said, I'm going to turn it over to Anita, who's been keeping an eye on the chat. I know she's been busy back and forth kind of prompting people, but maybe you can lead us through a couple of the questions, Anita.
So we were chatting about a rainfall or precipitation for various areas of Ontario. Steve, just to give you some idea, and this is only 5 towns. So here in Eastern Ontario, Kingston, Renfrew, 960, 970 millimeters, 810 millimeters. Guelph, 960. Peterborough, which is south central, 970, and then up the Bruce Peninsula and Markdale is 1045 mils. That's total annual precipitation.
Okay, so I'm a old school guy. I don't do millimeters very well.
So
25 millimeters in an inch. So the one example is 41 or 42 inches.
Yeah.
Yeah, so somewhere around between 30 and 40, most of those.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. So we had a bit of a discussion on dung beetles. Some folks do have dung beetles here in Ontario. Others hadn't seen them. Can you just like, do you, I mean, obviously, you know, they're where they are in parts of Alberta. Do you have any broader comments on that? Like how, is it soil dependent, soil type dependent?
Mostly is going to be your management dependent.
Okay.
Right. What products are you using? Are you using parasite controls? We have a Wednesday night networking podcast that you can go listen to. If you go to Podbean is where I go. There's multiple places where you can find it, but look for the Gateway Research Organization. I might be able to link that in chat here. Give me a minute. But yeah, we talked to a fellow by the name of Dr. Kevin Float. He's a research scientist out of Lethbridge, and he's done lots of studies on the effects of manure insects, right? Dung beetles and others. And he's found residues of the parasite controls that we use still coming out of the animal up to 4 months later. Okay, so if it's killing internal roundworms, it's affecting the dung beetles, it's affecting the all the other little critters in the dung pad and in the soil as well. Okay, so first off, I haven't used any parasite controls on my ranch in like 20 years. Okay, so that's a big step to begin with. Is how you get dung beetles is stop using chemicals. Okay, they don't do well with chemicals. 2, we've got to get a rotation going so that we. I mean, they fly. Somebody always asks me, well, where can we buy some? How can we bring them in? They're mobile. They fly, right? You build a system or you balance a system so that they'll be there. They'll show up. But then you'll get a bunch of dung beetles, and guess what happens? More predators come in. The cowbirds come in, and then your dung beetle populations drop, right? So it's this balance. I've been to farms where there's hundreds and hundreds of dung beetles in every cow pad. I don't have that. Right, I've had years where I've got lots, and then all of a sudden the next year I'm like, oh, I don't have as many. Like you can find some, but not near like we had the other year. But maybe on that year we've got 10,000 cowbirds flying around. Right, they're picking things that are flying out of the air, and includes dung beetles. So it's a balance. Back to the old Field of Dreams saying, right? If you build it, they will come.
Anyone with a live question for Steve? Let's generate some discussion here.
Yeah, I'm keeping an eye, Anita, to see if anyone's raised hand.
I haven't seen any.
We might have to start picking on people.
I'm going to link that podcast into the chat here. So
that'd be awesome.
Yeah, that would be great.
So this is the link just to all of them. You just have to search through it and find the one with Dr. Kevin Float. I'm pretty sure the title is like Dung Beetles or Manure or something, digging in the dung or something.
So Steve, we asked you to discuss the water cycle in the context of trying to drought proof our farms to some extent. Some of these properties that you when you first took over them and now been under your management for however many years, like what would be, obviously this is specific to your area, but when would you start to see that your management's impact on the local water cycle?
I wouldn't say it takes between 5 and 10 years to really start turning things around. I've had some fields that I've taken over that 1 or 2 years, and yeah, it's doing really well. But of course, those are good years, right? Like you can do this really fast if you always have rain. Trying to heal a piece of land through a drought, that gets pretty tough. And I've hit a lot of droughts. I hit 202, 203, 208, 209, 2014, 2015. They always seem to come in twos. So now we've got 2021. I'm betting 2022 is going to be a drought because I always get them in twos. So I'm already planning for that. We're going to understock a little bit or less stock than we normally would, just in case. But yeah, land I take over, it takes some time. I've had some that took over 10 years to get it where I really liked it. But again, depends on the moisture that we're getting those years. Because if you can't plan for a drought in a drought, right? If I've got really beat up, abused land, and we have a drought, yeah, it's still going to be beat up and abused, right? There's nothing I can really do about it if I don't get the rain to begin with. But once I get it going, after 10 years, 15 years, I did a post on my Facebook earlier this summer, and I compared a bunch of pictures. And I did the land that I've been managing for over 20 years, and then I did the pictures of the land that I've been managing for, between, I think it was 7 to 15 years, and then land that I was only managing for 3 years. Very visible differences, right? That land that I was managing for over 20 years, I mean, we didn't have a drought. We had grass 2 feet tall, cows did fine. We had lots of grass all season long. In between, it was browning off. We had that hot spell. Like we normally don't get 40-degree weather here, but we did, and it browned off. And the reason at that point, I don't think it was drought stress. I think it was heat stress, because after that heat went by, those pastures that browned off greened up again, and we hadn't had any rain. So we still had moisture in the ground. It was just heat stress. So they greened up, but of course that heat really dried things out. And then we started to get some drought stress. And that was after, a couple of months without very much moisture at all. I lost my train of thought there. Did I answer that question?
Yes, you did.
Okay.
So there's been a couple questions pop up in the chat box. Steve, do you feed any hay and do you make it yourself? From Andrew.
Okay, I knew that question was going to come up when I said it earlier. In my title, I said, I'm not going to give you any magic bullets tonight. So here, you just caught me. The one magic bullet, the only one that I've ever found in agriculture is bale grazing. Right? When I bale graze on a piece of land, it's like, boom, it fixes it. Right? You instantly get all this residue in the soil. So if you get fertility, right, it fixes it. Right? That's the only magic bullet that I've ever found. Now the problem with it is you can only cover a very small amount of land per year. Right? I could get 300 head in here and I'd only cover 35 acres. Right? That's a lot of years when I have 3,500 acres to cover. So yes, it's my little quick magic bullet, but I love bale grazing. I love feeding hay out on that land. It's bringing carbon in, and that carbon is that water holding capacity on top, stopping the runoff, stopping the evaporation. That's a big part of why I want to feed. Years ago, I actually had a cow herd and I sold them because my custom grazing was actually paying better. So I switched to custom grazing, and then I realized, ooh, if I'm not bringing feed in, I'm not bringing in all that carbon. That's my water holding capacity. So I switched over to custom feeding as well in the winter. So on some years, when it works and when the margins work for both me and the customer, then I will bring in bales and we'll custom bale graze for people. But then I get all the residue and all the water holding capacity. So I didn't want to own them and be paying for all that myself, because that sometimes can be a negative margin. But I figured out a way to do it and have someone else own them and pay me to do it. And I still get all that water holding capacity. So yes, I love bale grazing. I love importing feed. So that's why I don't make it myself. I want to import nutrients. I want somebody else who is willing to export their nutrients. I'm happy to bring them in, and I will take those nutrients without arguing whatsoever.
Great. Question on soil sampling. Do you soil sample any of your farms?
I do a little bit. Just if there's a concern I have, I did it a little bit at the beginning, and I kind of figured out that, okay, if I just leave things and it just repairs itself, right? So I had a soil agronomist come in quite a few years ago now, and I was having troubles keeping my legumes in. And the clovers would come, and then they'd leave, and then they'd come. And later on, I figured out it's just moisture. Again, water, right? Clovers love moisture. On a wet year, they come in like crazy, and on a dry year, they die out. Okay, so that's what it was. But I was like, oh, what's missing in my land? So I had this agronomist come in. He did soil tests. He basically said, well, you're a little low in nitrogen, which obviously, if my legumes are dying out, I could be a little low. And he said a little bit low in sulfur, but nothing major. But other than that, I have never seen such good soil characteristics. And I'd only been managing it maybe for 8 or 9 years. And he already said like pH, cation exchange capacity, all the other things. He just said he was just blown away by how good they were. So I'm like, okay, good. I don't have to do soil tests anymore. I know, we're moving that way. Now, there's probably times or places where it took me, 10 or 11 years to get a pasture coming around. And maybe I would have been better off to soil test, figure out what was missing, throw something at it, maybe to kickstart it, and then back away just to kickstart it into gear a little faster. Yeah, definitely that's a possibility. It kind of depends on your area too. If you're in an area where land is $300 an acre to rent, yeah, you're going to want to kickstart it into gear and get it going. Whereas, some of my land, I can rent it for, $15 an acre. So I can take the time. I still got a positive margin, so I can take a little bit more time to heal the land.
So I'm going to jump a couple and then come back to them, but there's one here back to your bale grazing. Opinion on bale grazing on depleted cropland.
You bet. I love it. The only thing you would watch out for on cropland is the next year, your maturity of your crop. Okay, so if you've got little circles of areas that hold moisture really well, then those plants are going to grow longer and they're going to mature later. So all of a sudden, you're going to get this maturity of this crop as a roller coaster. So the way to solve that is the first year after. We just did a video about it here not too long ago with a neighbor of mine. The first year back, he did a silage field so that it didn't matter when it germinates or when it matures, right? You're going to cut it all with silage anyway and take it off. So you could kind of plan for that. You could do a cover crop, or you could do some swath grazing or something on that year after. But boy, that's a really good way to kickstart your land into gear, that grain land. We have done it on grain land here ourselves as well. One year I basically rented a crop field from my grain farmer. It wasn't going to mature in time. It was oats and peas seeded together. So he's dabbling in polycultures, which I was really positive about. But he was dabbling in that, and he was planning on harvesting it, but it wasn't going to mature in time. And he said, you know what, let's just swath graze it. So we cut it. And he also had some hay that he couldn't sell at the time. So he said, you know what, I don't want to export this hay. Let's put it up and we'll bring it over and let's feed it on the land while you're swath grazing. So we kind of did a combination, swath grazing and bale grazing on the same field. So I did it in areas. He's a grain farmer, very modern grain farmer. He's got all the gadgets and gidgets in his tractor. So his yield monitor can tell every part of his field and where the good parts are and the bad parts are. So I said, okay, where are your worst parts of your field? And we lined up bales amongst the swaths in those areas. And then after we went through those areas with the swath grazing, so now the cattle have access to all of it. If I ever had to unroll a bale or give them a little bit more, I would go do it on those areas that he said were the weakest part. So the next spring, we were worried about this extra residue laying around, and he did rent a set of heavy harrows, and he zipped around out there and he drove back across everything. And when he got to those spots where we put lots of bales, I know he just turned a couple extra circles. right? Just to spread them out a little bit better. And then he would keep going, and just in the few spots where we put quite a few bales, he would do that. And yeah, his yield the next year was pretty even. You couldn't really tell. It balanced it out pretty good. So yeah, that's my
good combination.
Yeah.
You made the comment when you were talking about grazing management, trying to keep the plants in vegetative state. When you're doing that, the question comes up with respect to reseeding.
So I'm not very good at it, put it that way, right? You don't have to be perfect. Some plants will go to seed. Some years it will go to seed, especially, and I might choose to let them go to seed on some years. What I call it is deferred grazing. I'll let one paddock, let's say it's my worst paddock out of that field. I've got 24 paddocks on a good year. I'll take the worst one and I'll let it go to seed. Just let it go. And then the next year we come in, or maybe that fall or that winter, we come in with the herd and we try and knock it to the ground. We knock all those seeds down, knock the material down, and then we move on. So there's not a lot of gain in that part. So we might have to supplement during that. But what we did was we just healed that paddock. So, one paddock out of 24 didn't really affect my grazing that much this year. But if I do that every year, you know what? Those poorer producing paddocks, I'm going to heal them. It's going to be one more little tool in my tool belt. So yeah, sometimes they go to seed. Maybe even in all the other paddocks that we're grazing, maybe the cow or the sheep or whatever poops by that one. Well, they don't want to eat around their own feces. So that plant, when we move off, gets to mature and drop some seeds. So.
And I suspect some of the bale grazing, if that hay is mature and you got a good seeds, especially on the grasses, you'd be bringing seed in the hay bales as well, eh?
Oh yeah, I love it when farmers let their hay get too mature.
Yeah.
I'll have all sorts of clovers and alfalfas and stuff coming in that I never planted there, but they came in with the bales. So
yeah.
Now people argue, yeah, but that's where the Canada thistle came from too. But if you've got a weed problem, which we already said, there's no such thing as a weed, but if you have one from the bale grazing, that's not a winter feeding issue. That's a summer grazing issue. Okay, with proper grazing management, yes, you brought in those seeds, but with proper grazing management, you should be able to outcompete them, right? For maybe the first year or 2 years, you might have a few come up, but with proper grazing, they should disappear. Okay, so if you've got a prolonged weed issue because of bale grazing, it's not because of the bale grazing. It doesn't matter where the seeds come from. It's because of the summer grazing management. That's what you have to manage. Everybody blames somebody else. That's all.
So I purposely left this one to last, Steve. I was at this session as well a number of years ago. Well, more than a number. You were here in Ontario and you spoke at our Profitable Pasture series. And yep. Steve was at the one up in Elmwood, and his comment was, back in those days, sort of the buzzword was holistic practices, and now we're talking regenerative agriculture. From your perspective, what's the difference? Is there a difference?
Not really. There's lots of different schools of thought on it on the same thing. Yeah. They're just looking at things from a little bit different angle. The only reason I call it regenerative agriculture is that's the buzzword, right? When this first came out, regenerative agriculture was the buzzword. I was like, well, I call it sustainable agriculture or sustainable grazing, right? What's the difference? And then a lot of people argued, well, sustainable means to stay the same, whereas regenerative means to, improve and get better. I'm like, well, that's kind of splitting hairs, isn't it? Does it really matter? Right. So I guess my argument there is we need to regenerate the land to the point that it can be sustainable. Right. Mm-hmm. Is that a fair statement? Mm-hmm. And holistic management was where I started. Yes, 100%. I still consider myself a holistic management practitioner. There's just other things that I've learned and adapted and brought into it. Like I learn from everywhere, right? I go to every school and every conference and every seminar, and I bring something home and I kind of put it in a package. I'm not a holistic educator, right? I'm not a trained holistic management educator, so I'm not going to be teaching holistic management things. But it's the same ideas. It's the same. I give Alan Savory a huge credit to when I get started. I actually wrote an article a few years back called "The Pasture Preachers." Mm-hmm. Right? There's a whole bunch of pasture preachers out here standing on their soapbox graze. Your farm's different, right? You need to make it work for your farm. But the ideas and the concepts, all pretty well the same thing.
So that's it, Tom. That was the last questions in the chat box. I don't